So I think at this point, I will turn it over to Jessica Heitt and Jessica Wolff from the Nevada Department of Wildlife. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And it's all yours, Jessica.
Perfect, thank you so much. I'll go ahead and get our presentation up. All right, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jessica Heitt and I am a wildlife educator with the Nevada Department of Wildlife. I'm also joined this morning by my colleague Jess. Just want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. So I'm Jessica Wolff and I'm the Urban Wildlife Coordinator for the Western region in Nevada.
So we are here to talk to you a little bit about some more Nevada-specific laws and situations that you should be aware of. So let's go ahead and get started. So while we have over 894 different species in Nevada that the Department of Wildlife manages, these are going to be the main ones that we would expect you to come into contact with while doing your work. So there are all types of different bird species that you're going to come into contact with. So we have passerines, that's just going to be songbirds such as robins or sparrows, all kinds of raptors in Nevada. We have hawks, eagles, owls, falcons, ospreys, all different types of raptors, and also ground nesting birds to be aware of that might be hidden in bushes or on the ground near any of the trees you might be working on. We have gray squirrels in Nevada that often nest in trees as well, especially cottonwood trees. They like big riparian areas. You might come across a raccoon or a family of raccoons in trees as well. Or bats. We have quite a few species of bats. We have 23 different species in the state, and a number of them will also be roosting in trees. So definitely something to keep an eye out for. In Nevada, a lot of these different animals have special protections. So we have the Wildlife Action Plan, which is how we manage our animals in the state. And under that plan, there are 40 different bird species that have special protections and 9 different bat species. So if you happen to be able to identify what you're coming into contact with, or that would be helpful to know what laws are going to apply to you, or you can also call the department and we can help you figure it out as well. So in Nevada, some of the habitats that you might come across. So we are more than just a desert, although that is going to be the vast majority of it. We have 22 different types of habitats that can be found throughout Nevada. So desert scrub is what you're going to be finding more of in the southern Nevada, so like the Mojave Desert. A montane forest is going to be lots of big pine trees, like up near Lake Tahoe, up in the mountains. The sagebrush is going to be spread out throughout the majority of the state. We do have, although they're not very common, we do have riparian and wetland areas throughout the state. Alpine habitats at the very top of the mountains, and urban forests as well. But out of these 3 are the habitats I would expect you to be coming into contact with the most. And while all of our habitats throughout Nevada are very critical, definitely the riparian and wetlands is where you're going to find the most diversity of birds and other wildlife that you're likely to come into contact with. As far as Nevada-specific laws to be aware of, so for the most part, we definitely defer to federal protections under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. But we do have a Nevada revised statute, which basically just reinforces the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So it is a state level law that also protects all of the birds that are listed in the MBTA. And then we have an additional law that protects raptors as well. So definitely if you are finding any sort of raptors, take extra precautions when you come into contact with them. Any endangered species have extra protections as well. So these are the endangered birds that are listed in Nevada. So we have the bald eagle, peregrine falcon, the Yuma clapper rail, and southwestern willow flycatcher. So since those are endangered, that means that their populations are relatively limited. So you're unlikely to come into contact with them, but it's definitely something to be aware of regardless. Sensitive Nevada species, so they are on the decline, but they haven't quite been identified as an endangered species yet, include the northern goshawk, yellow-billed cuckoo, loggerhead shrike, sage thrasher, and brewer's sparrow as well. Under Nevada laws, there are only 2 bird species that have no protections at all. So if you were to come into contact with these, you could remove the nest without having to worry about any laws. And both of these are invasive species. So that would be the house sparrow and then the European starling. There are other birds that are exempt from the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that would apply in Nevada as well, such as pigeons or Eurasian collared doves would also fall under that category. So I'm going to bring up Jess Wolff. So Jess is our urban wildlife coordinator. So she is going to talk about some of the common scenarios that you might come into contact with.
Thanks, Jess. So yeah, we get lots of different calls for different reasons when it comes to birds and what to do when you come into contact with them. So here's just a list of a few that I've come across in the past year and Jess has come across as well. So one of the top ones is we have a new development and we want to remove all these trees. And potentially you find a nest there. So you definitely cannot remove those trees until the birds have left the nest. But there is a permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that you can try and obtain that would give you permission to remove that nest. But the best thing to do is kind of wait until the birds have left the area. Another scenario that I've had come up pretty regularly is I removed this branch from this tree, didn't know there was a nest there. What do I do? So the best thing to do is to find where you cut that branch down and try and place the nest back into the tree as close to where you originally cut down that branch as possible. The reason why we would rather do that is we want the parents to kind of take care of the young, give them the opportunity to take over. And also in the state of Nevada, we really don't have that many rehabbers. We have 3 right now, I believe, in the state, and not all of them deal with songbirds. So definitely trying to put the nest back where you found it is really important. Sometimes people call us and say, hey, we found a nest in a big pile of sticks from a bunch of different jobs, don't know where we got this nest from. So in that case, you can definitely contact a local rehabber. Again, we don't have that many, so there might not even be one in the area that you can use. But if you do find a rehabber, you're responsible for the transportation of that bird to that rehabber. And you can always give us a call, let us know what happened, but typically you're good to just take it directly to the rehabber and let them handle it. If you are in an area where you don't have a rehabber that accepts songbirds, it's best to take your best guess and try and put the nest back where it could have been taken from. So a tree is causing threat to human safety. In that case, you can remove the nest and try and relocate it in the tree, but definitely give us a call. Let us know what's going on if you can first. But if it's gonna be dropping on a house or something like that, we definitely don't want that to happen, and you're okay to remove that. A home or a business owner asks you to remove a nest. A lot of times we get calls, especially during the breeding season, where birds are getting a little nasty to humans and they're dive bombing and hitting people on the head and getting really protective of their nests. And this is a natural occurrence that happens pretty regularly, and people want those nests and those birds removed or relocated. You cannot do that unless you get a permit from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which again, that's not going to be something that they'll likely give out. So they have to wait until the nest is inactive in order to remove that tree and remove that habitat for those birds. But when in doubt, you can always just have the homeowner or business owner contact us, and I'm happy to tell them no. Another one is they found a young bird on the ground near a tree. Typically these are going to be fledglings, and it's best to leave them alone and try and avoid the area as much as possible. As long as the nest is not active in the tree any longer, you can continue to work, but don't mess with the fledgling and try and avoid the area where that bird is hanging out, and really make sure that you're aware of everything that's going on, because there can be other birds in the area. All right. So I just wanted to go over really quick the life cycle of some of our songbirds, just because this will give you a better idea, and you can give the owners of the property a better idea of how long it's going to take for an animal to leave the nest and the nest to become inactive. So this right here is a hatchling. They are bald, they have their eyes closed, they're very alien-like, looking not so cute right here. And they're fully dependent on their parents for food and warmth. So these birds will be in the nest, hanging out, really need their parents around in order to take care of them. So in the chat, if you want to put what type of bird you think that was, give it like a minute or so. Any guesses for my alien friend? Got pigeon, okay.
I think that identifying nestlings is incredibly difficult. It's something that I have no skill set for.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's one of the hardest things. All right, we didn't get it yet. So let's take a look at what it's going to next. So this is a nestling. They have few to no feathers, but their eyes are open. They're a lot less alien-like, looking more like a bird, thankfully. But they are still dependent on their parents. So in any of these two instances, if you find one of these on the ground, you can totally put it back in the tree, help them out a little bit. Birds don't have a very good sense of smell, so they're not going to reject their young just because you placed it back in there. Any guesses now? I see one right answer. Robin, yep, awesome. So I've got some American robins, and you are totally correct. That was an American robin from the beginning. But now it is a fledgling. It's partially or fully feathered. They are on the ground. They'll be on the ground, hopping around for a couple days to a week or two, and they're much more bird-like. Got through the awkward stage, so happy. And they're much less dependent on their parents. So in some species, they'll still come around and feed them and watch over them and provide some protection. Awesome. So as for resources, you can always give us a call. So I'm the Urban Wildlife Coordinator for the North. So Reno area, Sparks, Carson City, Gardnerville, all that, you can give me a call. And then I have a counterpart down in Las Vegas. Her name is Lauren McLeod. She can be reached down for the southern region. And if you have an emergency, you can always call our dispatch. As for rehabbers in my region, we only have one. Her name is Evelyn, but she takes all sorts of wildlife, so you don't have to worry about anything there. We have Linda in Imlay, that's near Winnemucca area. And then we also have Lisa Ross down in Las Vegas, but she only accepts raptors. So in the Las Vegas area, if you're doing a pre-work inspection, it's incredibly important that you be very, very careful before you remove anything, because there really aren't any rehabbers down there that can take on birds other than raptors. And then other resources, I always like to plug All About Birds and the Merlin Bird ID. Both of these are great options to take a look at. With All About Birds, if you can get an ID of a bird, hopefully you'll see a parent around that you can kind of see. You can give people a better idea of how long it's going to take for those birds to leave the nest, because they actually have estimates on the incubation period and the nestling period for a lot of passerines. So if you can get an ID, I definitely suggest looking that up, and then you can kind of guesstimate when it would be safe to go back to that work site. And then the Merlin Bird ID is another great app that you can download onto your phone, and it can actually help you identify what bird is in the area. So those are all really great resources that can help you out. And I'm done.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess. And Ryan, that's all we have. So I'll stop sharing and pass it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. I hadn't realized how few wildlife rehabilitators there are in Nevada, and how much that might change the recommendations. It really struck me that we spend so much time talking about how important it is to contact a wildlife rehabilitation person anytime there's sort of any questions, any time you have an opportunity where you might be in a wildlife emergency, and that it seems like when there aren't so many around that you really would need to do something else. That really struck me.
If you know anyone that wants to become one, send them our way.
We very much want more.
Cara, did you have any questions or anything come up noteworthy to you besides the wildlife rehabilitation issue I mentioned?
Nope, we're all good.
All right. Well, thank you too. We'll definitely stick around if you can, and we'll have a little more discussion and question and answer time at the end. But at this point, we can go back into it, where we're going to talk a little bit about some of the specifics of the Arizona and Nevada BMPs. So I had mentioned last time that there are 3 main federal wildlife laws that we want to be aware of. The Eagle Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And what we had just talked about with that question that came up was about the state laws. So it sounds like we have 2 state laws in Nevada, 1 state law in Arizona that we need to be worried about, we need to be concerned about, and that they seem to be relatively similar to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and we're going to work out any specifics of that. But largely, I think sort of we're thinking that not only for legal reasons, but for ethical and public opinion reasons, we really want to be acting responsibly around these wildlife. So I think the laws aren't the only reason to be following the best management practices and acting responsibly around wildlife. So we'll just try to keep that in mind. I also talked about the breeding season and showed that the breeding season in California, we've designated as February 1st to August 31st in the best management practices. But as we're expanding to different regions, we need to think about how to handle those different regions. So Troy Corman from the Arizona Game and Fish Department has provided us a handy table that I think we're going to include in the best management practices. And it talks about the habitat, the region, the elevation, and what the breeding season is associated with each of those. And what I'm going to sort of pitch today, and we'll be able to discuss and talk about a little more, is that most people most arborists in Arizona and Nevada can consider using the 15th of January to the 30th of June as their breeding season. This is a little shorter and a little earlier than we've used elsewhere, but let's talk a little bit about why. So that chart basically breaks down this sort of, it based on elevation, right? So less than 3,000 feet, that's our red areas here, primarily in the southwest. And that these are gonna be really hot, and the breeding season is gonna be early, 15th of January to 30th of June. Then in these yellow areas, these are the areas that are between 3,000 and 6,000 feet, are going to be, it's going to be a little hotter later. And so the breeding season sort of scales, shifts a little bit later in the year, where it's March 15th to July 30th. And then for the high elevation areas, spring comes late in these areas. So the breeding season is really the 15th of April to the 15th of August. So if we take this model that has been recommended to us for Arizona and apply it to Nevada, we can see that Nevada really has a much larger area above 3,000 feet. But if you look at where most arborists are, and most arborists are working, and I believe most people who are attending this session in Nevada and Arizona are from, they're really from the Phoenix and Las Vegas areas. These are areas that are hot early, less than 3,000 feet, and going to have this early breeding season. So I'm going to recommend that what we do for these 2 states, and we'll work out the details of all of this, is that most Nevada and Arizona arborists use the 15th of January to the 30th of June as their breeding season. So breeding season ended quite a while ago, which I think makes sense because it's almost certainly very, very hot there right now. And that once you get outside of these areas, if you're working in Prescott, if you're working in Reno, if you're working somewhere else, that's when you want to start looking at your elevations and trying to figure that out. So one of the ways that I like annoying my friends and family and coworkers is I talk about data a lot. And one of the best ways to get data for birds is with these breeding bird atlases. So here's the Arizona one right here. And, and so these are just dense with data. And so if you were thinking that that breeding season doesn't make sense, I have just a couple of examples here to show you of how maybe these are the right breeding seasons. So what I've done here is I've gone through this book and I've picked out 4 species. So early in the breeding season is the Costa's hummingbird. It breeds pretty early, like in late March, early April seems to be the main time. And then the great horned owl breeds a much longer period of the year, much wider stretch, but also seems to peak there in sort of late April, early May. Mourning dove really breeds across a wide time period, but it seems to peak in sort of mid-May, early May. And then the yellow-rumped warbler really seems to breed later in the year, that its peak breeding is really in this sort of July time period. And so what we do when we try to figure out the breeding season is we want to line up a whole bunch of these, like when do most species breed, so that we can figure out where capture that within the breeding season. So, but we need to know more about these species. So for example, yellow-rumped warblers in Arizona basically only breed above 6,000 feet. So we can see that the time period in which we find nests for yellow-rumped warblers fits almost perfectly into this time period that Troy has given us for above 6,000 feet from April 15th to August 15th. So if we want to take that out, because we're looking at most arborists in the area who are working in the greater Phoenix and greater Las Vegas areas, we can see that most of the species seem to be doing most of their breeding between January 15th and June 30th. So I think that that's a pretty good estimate of the breeding season, and I think that's what we're going to suggest using for now, and we'll see how that works and as we go along with it. The next thing we want to do in our best management practices is start thinking about habitat value. So let's say that this is our site that we're going to be working in, and we want to try to figure out what sort of habitat value does this have. And we've recommended in the best management practices some characteristics which we might use to go about figuring that out. And so I don't know if these are going to work in Arizona and Nevada. I think that they will. I think that some of the sensitive areas are similar to the sensitive areas in California. I don't know that this is working all that well in California. We're looking for feedback and looking for people to be involved in how this is going and what we can do. So in this area here, we're adjacent to water bodies and we have riparian vegetation present. We're pretty sure that this is a riparian area and that we think that those are really important areas for wildlife in Arizona and Nevada. So we would classify this as a sensitive habitat. Maybe this illustration here doesn't represent what it looks like in Arizona and Nevada. Maybe something like this would be a better description, where we have these sort of deserty hills with this riparian corridor running through the middle, where we'd really expect nesting wildlife to really like those areas and be more likely to find nesting wildlife in those areas. Then we have a different site that looks something more like this. This might be like an urban park managed pretty wildly. And if we apply these same characteristics, try to figure out what the habitat value might be, we might come up with pretty different answers, right? We might say that it has pretty low impervious surfaces, high plant species diversity, high plant structural diversity, a lot of grasses and forbs down low, shrubs in the middle, and trees up high, all of the above. There appear to be many mature, dead, and dying trees and abundant wildlife present. But there's also some that fit into the low category, right? There might be high human use and it appears to be relatively far from water bodies. So I think we can sort of use this to start thinking about what is the habitat value. And in our system, we would classify this as high because it would have more check marks in the top. But maybe we would also understand that there's maybe a gradient between the two or something like that. But this is the idea that we're trying to use of how would we use habitat value when we're thinking about how likely we are to find nesting wildlife. And maybe again, this illustration isn't very good. Maybe a high value habitat area looks something more like this in your area, or we need to get some different pine forests or something else. So let's think about what a high value habitat looks like in your area, and how can we try to schedule more of that work in the non-breeding season than the breeding season. I think that would be a good goal for us. Then on my average job site, looks something like this, some sort of shopping center parking area where we think that there's some chance that we'd find nesting wildlife, but really relatively low. And if we use our sort of classification system, we can be pretty sure that we're looking at a low value habitat here and somewhere that we'd be comfortable working in the breeding season, but we'd want to do a pre-work inspection. And so a low value habitat in your area might look something a little bit more like this. I don't know. Let's continue that conversation and talk about what these different habitat types and values look like in your different communities. So I think when we talk about this, it often seems so simple, right? Of like sensitive, high, low, I should be able to go out and figure that out. But it's not always that easy. So let's take a little poll here and talk about how easy is this to classify? What would you classify this as? Is this a sensitive or a high or a low habitat value area? And looks like we've got the poll up and running. So jump in there. I'll just ask a general question to my fellow panelists. Is my video running? Because I can't actually see it anywhere.
Yes, you're good.
Thank you.
And we have a comment that might be interesting to talk a bit about in the chat box from Philip Loftus. Unfortunately, during pre-project inspections, we have had nestlings and nests up until the last few weeks in Maricopa County.
Yeah, Cara, you must be dealing with this in Southern California. Must be, parts of your region must be similar to Maricopa County, right?
Right.
What's your experience with the breeding season in hot deserty regions versus other regions?
That's partly why we just keep it through the end of August for our whole territory, because we do still find birds like house finches and mourning doves that will nest even in some of the hotter parts of our area through the end of August and sometimes even later. So yeah, something for us to think about in coming up with our time frame for the BMPs.
Yeah, so I think this is not, we're actively figuring this out right now, and I'm just sort of starting this conversation and just started looking at the data, so I think it's really interesting. And how long do we want to extend it to make sure we're capturing every single nesting bird? That's probably not possible, right? We're going to have to cut it off somewhere. So we'll see how that shakes out, and working with our project partners in Arizona. Okay, let's go ahead and share the results. So it looks like most people think that this is a high value habitat, although we have some answers. People are confident though. I don't have a single I don't know on here. So if I were classifying it, I would say that it would probably be pretty close, right? I've got several check marks in high related to the plants and pervious surfaces, but I think that this is a residence. I think it's got pretty high human use, and I'm not sure there's a lot of wildlife around. So I would probably be ending up classifying this as low, but I think that we can see that this is pretty difficult, right? That there's a lot of gray area and a lot of unsureness, is that a word? In trying to figure this out. So let's just recognize that this is going to be difficult and something we're going to have to practice and experiment with. Okay, I've got one more. So how about this one? What do we think? Is this, can we pull up poll number 3? What is the habitat value of this site? Okay, the responses are overwhelming. I don't think we have to let this go on any further. Yeah, I agree that I think that this is a low value site, relatively easy to identify this, but maybe you had different things that you were looking at in different pieces. So I think this is an interesting idea, and I look forward to figuring out what exactly we're gonna do with these pieces for Arizona and Nevada and how we're gonna make California better. The main goal
I have a comment from Joshua Hallett in the Q&A. With the new norm as urban interface being a big factor anymore these days, how do we classify it as we overpopulated our forest?
Sure. So I think probably the easiest way to think about this habitat value idea is to say, city centers are low habitat value, the urban wildlife interface is high habitat value, and then like the, national parks are sensitive or something like that. That's not really the goal that we've established here. We've come up with these factors that we think could go into it, but I think that that's a totally valid and important point of how are we actually going to approach this and do this. And I don't have all the answers, but I think this is the best approach that we've come up with so far. And I look forward to somebody stepping in someday and telling me how we should be doing that. Cara, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Nope, I agree.
Will you stop agreeing with me all the time, Cara? We need to have some interesting discussion and debate here.
Say something controversial, Ryan.
Okay, so the idea here is that we bring together the breeding season and the habitat value to try to determine what level of training is appropriate to work in these areas, right? So the idea is with this orange area, hopefully by the end of these 3 weeks, everyone's feeling comfortable working in a high value habitat during the non-breeding season and low value habitats during the non-breeding season, and has good contacts with wildlife biologists for these other scenarios where maybe they're not feeling comfortable with it. So that's our goal here for this workshop. So let's talk a little bit about pre-work inspections. I think this is the most important tool that we have as arborists to act more responsibly around wildlife. So when we go out to do a pre-work inspection, we can do it the morning of our project or maybe a few days before, and we want to be looking for wildlife, listening for wildlife, looking for feces on the ground, looking for nests or potential nests. And we can note these, but we don't necessarily need to stop our project or do anything about them. These are just things that we're looking for. We're looking for potential signs of nesting wildlife. And so I would break these into sort of 4 different categories. We've got animal behavior. Examples of this are robin carrying the stick up to its nest up in the top picture, or the finch collecting nesting material in the lower picture to bring to its nest. We could listen and try to pull out important parts of the calls or the songs that we're hearing. And then there's sort of all these feces or pellets from owls. We could have scraps of food or feathers, other parts that we might be getting hints of that maybe we have a nest in the area. And then obviously we're going to be looking for nests and we want to be aware of them. It's hard to find nests, you know, they hide them. So using some of these other tools and signs of nesting wildlife can be important. Okay, so I'm going to play a quick video here to talk a little bit about the sort of different life stages of the nesting season of this sort of what it takes to breed here. So the first is we have an Anna's hummingbird here and she is building her little nest. This is about 12 feet off the ground in a glossy privet. And during this time period, she's doing a lot of collecting of material, bringing back and weaving them into the nest. So this is a good time and relatively easy time to find this nest because she's going back and forth to the nest so often. She's collecting spider webs, she's collecting little twigs, she's collecting lichen. But here, she's sitting on her eggs. She's incubating those eggs, trying to keep them warm. She's not doing anywhere near as many trips right now. So when there's eggs in the nest, they can be a little bit harder to find. And then once you've got the eggs hatch, she's again off going and grabbing insects and bringing them over, drinking nectar, bringing it over, and doing all of those things. So she's really visiting the nest pretty often and going back and forth to care for the young. So you can imagine that during different parts of this breeding period, there's different strategies, different ways to find these nests, and that once the young have left the nest, pretty quickly they're going to look like full adult hummingbirds, but they'll be following mom around, asking her to feed them and things like that. So we can continue identifying them as sort of recently fledged young. But these are the periods that we're most worried about, right? When we have eggs or young in the nest. So I have a friend who, was that you, Cara?
It was, yep. So we have a question about the photo prior to this video from Joshua Hallett. Previous photo, oh, you know what, maybe it's one before this one. Well, let me read it. Showed a saguaro cactus along with a few other low-lying vegetation along with trees for nesting. So with that being said, do you think that this would aid in protecting wildlife and nesting birds?
Okay. I haven't spent a lot of time in Arizona and Nevada. That's why I've invited people like Jessica and Jessica to come join me here. I have very few photos of Nevada and Arizona, so I found any photos that I could. We're definitely working on that. If I was a more organized, coordinated person, I would have done a much better job of getting more illustrative photos and things like that together. So if there's Cara, is there a question in there that's not just my lack of photos to show off the points that I'm trying to make, do you think?
Yeah, no, I think I think, and maybe we need a clarification from Joshua on exactly what he was asking, because I didn't see a photo with a saguaro in it, but he said that the previous photo showed a saguaro. So do we have one or no?
Yeah, it's a ways back though. So.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. And his question was that, so that being said, do you think that this would aid in protecting wildlife and nesting birds? And I'm not quite certain what he means by what would aid.
Well, let's continue moving, and maybe Joshua can provide a little more clarity to the question, and we'll circle back to it.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So I have a friend who worked for a researcher in finding nests, right? So the researcher was studying nesting wildlife, and she would go out into the forest and find nests all day. That was her job. So she got very good at it. And what she does is all about the bird behavior, following the females, right? So that Anna's hummingbird that kept coming back to the nest, that was how she would find these nests. And some of the things she did was looking for materials in their bill. If they're holding nesting materials or food or fecal sacs, they're actually taking feces away from the nest and dropping them somewhere else. And looking for repeat visits to a single area, that was the sorts of signs that she was really looking for. And in particular, she was looking for long flights, especially in pairs, right? If two birds are doing an especially long flight, something she's looking for as long as these sort of mate guarding and nervous behaviors. So I want to suggest that these are really sort of advanced techniques, and we're not expecting any of you to be experts in any of this, but there are some ideas here and some things that we can really be more aware of and be looking for. So I have a feeling that when I shared my screen, I didn't share my audio. So let me just do that again real quick, where we're going to share screen. Okay. Because for this next one, we have a little audio here. So definitely listen to what's going on here. And we basically, I discovered this nest by hearing these nestlings begging. So there's this really sort of soft, high-pitched cry that I'm hearing from, 100 feet away, a long ways away. And then I want to find where exactly the nest is. So I'm looking for mom to come and visit and drop off some insects. This is a red-naped sapsucker in Montana in a quaking aspen tree. And so this is a good thing for us to really remember, that so much about birding is about listening, is about being able to recognize these sounds and be able to follow them back and then use visual cues after you've done that. So I have a couple more examples here where we want to sort of identify what's an alarm call. What of these calls is sort of more concerning than the others? So these are California scrub jay calls. And so this is what I would call a flight call, where they often do this call as they're going from like the top of one tree to another tree. So we have a name for that of a flight call. And then here we have a pretty standard scrub jay call. This is something that you could just hear every day, sort of in your backyard, of this sort of slow, punctuated call here, where it's just contacting people, checking in, seeing what's going on. Probably not contacting people, it's probably contacting other birds, but something like that. And then you can hear the difference between that and this call, which is what I would classify as an alarm call, right? This is either warning other scrub jays in the area, hey, something's wrong, or trying to scare someone away. We have this much more rapid, much different sort of call. And so while we're not expecting anyone to be experts in this, I think that we can sort of gain some understanding of how important our ears are when we're doing pre-work inspections. Okay, and so then the next piece is the biology, right? The feces at the sort of sprayed down the tree. We have some burrowing owl pellets and a granary tree. So whenever you see a granary tree, we're pretty sure that there's acorn woodpeckers nesting relatively close to there. But you may find other scraps. You may find, food, especially under raptor nests. You'll often find sort of food pieces scattered around below them and things like that. And those can all be signs that we have a nest nearby. And then totally the actual nest could be pretty obvious, right? These are heron nests on the left, and we have some woodpecker excavated cavities on the right that looks like they're several years old, but maybe somebody else is using them at this point. And nests can come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. So upper left, we have our classic robin cup nest that is sort of what I think most of us picture when we think of nests. But all of these are nests, right? So the excavated woodpecker cavity, where it drilled a little hole and then a big cavity on the inside of that tree. We have a platform nest with our red-tailed hawk in the upper right. This may be 6 feet across. Pendulous nests are really important for orioles and bush tits and other species that we might find in Nevada and Arizona, where they sort of hang down. Oriole nests are very commonly hanging down from the palm fronds, like this one illustrated here. Hummingbirds build more or less cup nests, but very, very small. And black phoebes are nesting on a building here. We still have some chance of disturbing this nest, even though it's not in a tree. We would want to be aware of it and make sure we're checking out any of these mud and twig nests that are built on buildings and other things like that. Several species of wildlife nest in natural cavities, like these barn owls are doing here. And we can have this scrape nest on the ground, right? So like a killdeer, for example, nests on the ground, and there's basically no nest there at all. Hard to tell that anything exists there. We'd want to be able to differentiate these nests from either a squirrel nest, a dray in the lower left, and be able to potentially treat that differently, or at least identify it as such, and an old falling apart nest. And what we're really trying to do is, once we've found these nests, is try to determine whether or not they're active. Right, so I don't need to get inside that woodpecker, that sapsucker cavity there to be able to know that that's active. I can hear the nestlings. I'm seeing them feeding. I don't need to see anything else. I know that's an active nest. For a cup nest, you may be able to look into it. But generally, what wildlife biologists are going to do is they're going to watch these nests and watch for adults visiting and things like that. And that's how they tell whether they're inactive or not. So I think that you know, we both have some tools to be able to get up into these trees and be able to see into those nests, but that can actually cause a lot of disturbance to these wildlife. So we want to make sure that we're being careful about doing that if we do take an approach like that. You can find nests way up high in trees and down on the ground, in shrubs, and at every sort of elevation, in live trees and dead trees and native trees and non-native trees. You can find nests everywhere. So our ability to disturb a nest on the ground is pretty high too. So we want to make sure that we're looking not just at the tree we're working on, but all around the area to try to figure out where there may be nests and where we may be impacting them. Oh, I wanted to talk about palm trees while we were looking at that for a second. So palm trees seem to be particularly important in California, Nevada, and Arizona, especially for owls and orioles. But I think that we're seeing more and more that palm trees seem to be pretty high habitat value and something we should be keeping an eye out for. So it's important to document our pre-work inspections for a variety of reasons, and we've given you some options for how to do that. There's one in the best management practices, and the upper right, we've developed one that's a little bit more sort of, what would I call it, a little bit less tied to the best management practices, but just sort of a general use of what's the habitat value and things like that. But we're really excited about this website created by in Arizona for doing our pre-work inspections. So we'd like to encourage everyone to give that a try and see how that goes and see what we need to improve on that. And so what we're going to do now is watch Courtney, who's going to be one of our main presenters tomorrow. If you're interested in tuning in to see what she has to say and ask her questions. She's going to do a pre-work inspection. And I'm going to be sort of filling out the survey 1, 2, 3 pre-work inspection form on the right while she's going. So we'll check this out, and I noticed that we're coming up on 12 o'clock right here. Since we've answered a couple of questions, we're just gonna run 5 or 10 minutes over and then start the question period, and people can sign off at that point. So let's start the video here.
Hello everyone. So I am bringing you with me on a nesting bird survey for some trees that need to be trimmed for a utility company, and I wanted to show you guys some in-field clues that would tell you that there is a nest nearby without actually seeing the bird or the nest or hearing the bird actually. So I'm going to flip the camera around and I will show you what I look for when I look for nests. Hello. Hi everyone. So you are with me on a nesting bird survey, and some of the trees within this stand need to be trimmed for a utility company. And I am going to show you some things that I find in the field that show me that there is a nest without actually seeing the nest or the bird. And these are just things that I look for. So we're gonna take a walk. These are the trees that need to be trimmed. And I did a little walk through here and I found some really interesting things in this palm tree. So I'm cheating a little bit because I know that barn owls like palm trees, just like this one, old, with a nice skirt. And I know that it creates a shelf, and essentially it creates a cavity. And barn owls are cavity nesters. So now what I'm starting to look for is whitewash, and basically any indication that there's a nest in here that, because I won't be able to see it. So let's look at the ground. And what I'm seeing here is, I'm seeing some feathers, particularly this one is a barn owl feather. Found that on the ground. I didn't plant it, I promise. And then now what I'm gonna look for is I'm gonna look for pellets because I know that barn owls are really messy nesters. I will look for pellets and whitewash. So here's a very old pellet. There's a pellet. Oh, that's interesting. It's an old nest. Oh, with some eggs in it. Okay, back to the barn owl. There's some whitewash. It's very little, but some whitewash. Oh, and another barn owl feather. Perfect. And then let's see if we can find one more pellet for you guys. Okay, here's another pellet. This one looks relatively fresh. So these are just some of the things that I look for. The whitewash is not to an extreme amount that you normally see. Here's some more though. And I'm just looking on the ground directly beneath the palm tree. So this would lead me to believe that there is a barn owl nest. There either was or there is currently a barn owl nest in this palm tree. Now you're gonna say, Courtney, well, that's great, but owls are nocturnal. And I would say, yeah, you're right. So then what you would have to do is enlist a wildlife biologist to do a night survey to determine whether or not it's active or not. Barn owls have several clutches, and they can have 2 to 3 clutches in a season, so that could be active even this late in the game. Here's another feather. It could, and some whitewash. It could be active this late in the season, but you wouldn't know without a nighttime survey. So this is a good example of, you know that there could potentially be a nest in this tree, but you're not quite certain, so you'd have to enlist a wildlife biologist. And I hope that was a good example.
Okay. So what we're going to do is just do a quick wrap up of what we've covered today, and then Kara's going to tell me all the things that we got wrong and need to discuss and keep going from there. So we talked a little bit about the Arizona and Nevada breeding season, and I've suggested the 15th of January to 30th of June might be a good one, but we've already heard that that might not be adequate and something that we're going to look into what makes the most sense. We've talked a little bit about habitat value and about how to go about classifying that in Arizona and Nevada, and hopefully you all are going to experiment with that and then get back to me. Tell us what you thought was hard about that, what you thought was easy about it, what would be a better way of doing it. We're all going to go out and practice a pre-work inspection. So going out there, looking for wildlife, looking for signs of nesting wildlife, and we're going to use the Arizona pre-work inspection form to do that. There are other options if you don't want to use this form. I would probably use this on my phone while I was standing out there in the field, but certainly other ways to go about doing it. And we did a little activity where we watched Courtney do that. Cara, what do we want to talk about? What do we want to do first?
So we can go back to Joshua Hallett's question about the photo with the saguaro and the building next to it. And it kind of looks like you've got habitat, but it's also kind of like backyard habitat. And so yeah, a lot of people could classify it as low threshold, but he says, as we move in these less populated areas with homes and buildings that are by critical habitat or landscaping that is done to facilitate bringing in a wide variety of nesting birds and other animals, how might that impact how we classify an area like this?
Yeah, so I think to me, you know, as I'm interpreting this question, one thing, by the way, one thing that I hate about these online formats, so thank you everyone for sticking with us here, is that I love having this sort of back and forth with the audience and like being able to clarify questions and things like that. So it feels so awkward doing this alone in my house, in my office here. So anyways, I really see this as a couple of different points that are interesting and I wish we had time to dive really deep into. One is the sort of idea of that we're sort of constantly bumping up against nature, degrading nature, you know, making it landscape and then bumping up against it again. And so I do think that there's, you know, there isn't much opportunity in what we're working on and talking about for this sort of preservation aesthetic of how do we really preserve this sort of high value habitat that's going on out there is not so much our focus. Our focus is really on we're doing some work. How do we make sure that we're not impacting, that we're minimizing our chances of impacting nesting wildlife? And one of the ways that I think we can help do that is to be thinking more about habitat value and about things like that right now. But also, and then third sort of separate point is we also think a little bit about managing wildlife habitat, about how can we make our habitat better for wildlife in areas where we think that's important? How can we make you know, habitat that's going to provide our ecosystem services and not bring a bunch of pests in and things like that? So I think these are the sorts of decisions we should be having, conversations we should be having. Joshua, I'm happy to connect with you anytime, reach out to me and we can talk more about it.
One thing I would add to that is something that probably most of the states have, but definitely all across North America, everybody should have access to things like Fish and Wildlife Services, critical habitat layers. If you just do a Google search, you should be able to find those. A lot of states have their own natural history databases with information on where sensitive species are observed and sensitive habitats. And so if you are in an area that feels like that in-between space of low and high habitat value, you could use those resources to look and see, are you actually adjacent to critical habitat? And that happens here in urban areas in California for sure. I imagine it happens for both of Nevada and Arizona as well, where you've got something like a little riparian corridor right along a housing development, and you could have southwestern willow flycatchers there, or cuckoos or whatever. So if you're in doubt, you can use those resources to try and look at whether an area that appears to be borderline, you could classify into one or the other based on that information.
Well said, absolutely. I'm seeing that we have some questions about accessing Survey 123. So that should be, again, in that handout, but let me drop in the chat the direct link so that people can go straight there if they're interested. I was interested, Cara, unless you have something more pertinent, in harassing our Nevada Jessica guests about tree risk and whether when it's okay to remove a nest from a risky tree.
Go for it. We've got one more question in the Q&A, but we can move on to that in a bit.
So just so you know, most arborists, most of us think about tree risk a lot and have a very formal system of designated what the tree risk is, of assessing tree risk. And so one thing that we recommend is that it has that we have a very formal assessment of what that risk is, and then that the agencies have a pretty high tolerance of tree risk. So that if you say, oh, this is a dangerous tree, I want to know, well, what was it assessed as in terms of tree risk, and what do we think that the agencies will tolerate? Do you understand this language at all, and do you have any insight about how risky this tree has to be for those situations?
Right, so without knowing much about how your level of tree risk, I would say if it's about to fall on a house or a business or anywhere that there could possibly be property damage where people are inside, that is something that we would recommend that you can go ahead and do whatever you need to do to remove the nest or remove the branch or whatever it might be. So if there is impending property damage where humans are involved, absolutely, you can remove it. And if you have time and you can call us and get the okay from us to go ahead, that's always suggested. But if it's a weekend and you can't get a hold of anybody, then you just need to do whatever you need to do to protect property and people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, say that again.
I was asking Jess Wolff if there was anything she wanted to add to that.
No, that's exactly how I would say too, just as long as there is an actual risk, a tangible risk that you can see.
Well, if you're ever interested in talking more about it, happy to talk to you more about it. The phrasing I use is imminent failure and extreme risk, and then we can sort of talk about other scenarios from there. Imminent failure, extreme risk, do what you need to do. Other scenarios besides that, we probably have time to talk about it. So that's how I start thinking about it. Happy to discuss with you all or anyone else about it in the future.
I think that makes perfect sense.
Cara, what else do we have?
Sorry, it always takes a moment for my mouse to find the mute button. So Randy Coleman says it would be nice to include the Mojave Desert and Borrego area in SoCal with this map. So that's 1, 2, 3.
Good observation. And I have, I happen to download the entire United States for this elevation map. So I have all those data, and we could certainly look at the similarities between the states and things like that. I think lots of interesting things to do. Just a little insight into me, I download data and then I'm useless for the next few days because that's what I'm dealing with of trying to get my head around that. So I'm trying to confine myself. I've got I've got 5 more workshops I have to teach people. I can't be digging into these data that deeply at the moment. Anything else that anyone wants to talk about? Well, Jessica, and Cara, I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today. It's so great to have people who are really experts in this to go along with people like me who are just doing our best. So thanks for joining us, and really look forward to connecting with you and working with you all more about this.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.
And then I'll take this opportunity to again thank our major funders. So the Forest Service is the major funder for this workshop, but the Britain Fund and and CAL FIRE and several Audubons and other people, thank you so much for all of your contributions. And we really couldn't do it without you. And with that, I'd like to say thanks everyone. I'll see you next week, tomorrow, whenever you tune in again, I'll be here.